Thank you for joining us today on ETFA. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. Birds act as indicators of the health of our environment, alerting us when ecosystems are out of balance. They occur nearly everywhere, but due to differing ecological requirements, particular species are uniquely distributed. Knowledge of the occurrence of birds can be used to identify the places that are most important for the conservation of biodiversity. Currently, bird lovers are counting wetland birds today on ETFA. We will focus on the reasons for this exercise and the task before us to save these important animals. Do stay with us. Enthusiastic birders and ornithologists across the country are fanning out to wetlands to take stock of the bird population. The main purpose of the waterbird census was to ascertain the population of waterbirds. During the last waterbird counts conducted in January 2016, an estimated 166,469 waterbirds across 212 species were counted, of both resident and migratory birds. At the moment, birders are working to give verve to Nigeria's important bird and biodiversity areas.
Several birds, actually.
Dr. Shola Iwajomo is one of them, and he lectures at the University of Lagos in Akoka.
Now, one of the things with migratory birds is that they are born with an innate capacity to migrate. Now, within that migratory program that they're born with is also a directional sense. So they have something like a map within their brain that tells them that at a certain time of the year, you're supposed to fly south or southwest and end up somewhere in Africa. Now, for first-year birds, in some species of birds, the first-year birds would follow the adults, so they learn along the way. But some other birds, the adults will depart the breeding grounds before even the first-year birds are fully fledged from the nest. So the first-year birds are left to fly on their own. And studies have shown that the first-year birds also end up the same place where the adults have gone to. So it proves that there is some sort of inherited migratory program. So there is a migratory program that controls this behavior.
Birds undertake remarkable journeys navigating across land and sea to find refuge as the seasons change, from endurance flights exceeding 10,000 kilometers by bar-tailed godwits to the annual relay of Arctic terns, which fly the equivalent of the distance to the moon and back 3 times during their lives. Other examples include the sooty shearwater, which flies 64,000 kilometers from the Falkland Islands to the Arctic, and the tiny blackpoll warbler, which flies for 3 days non-stop across the open ocean from eastern Canada to South America.
There's a joint collaboration along what we call the East Atlantic Flyway, where you have countries from the Arctic towards Europe and then Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, all the way to South Africa. There's a collaborated effort in counting waterbirds as they migrate. This is to monitor their population, because birds, they breed in the Arctic and in Europe, in the temperate region, and then they spend their winter in the subtropical Africa. So because of that, as I'm in sub-Saharan Africa, so because of that, there's a need to monitor their population. It has been noticed worldwide that the population is declining. And because of that declining population, there was a need to monitor them. And then it's as I said, is a collaborative effort, so that we don't just monitor the breeding sites and then monitor their wintering sites differently. So we'll monitor all the sites at the same time, so that we'll be able to have at least an estimate, a rough estimate of the numbers that we can actually rely on. So that is what is happening. So every year, between January and February, organized by Wetlands International, birds are monitored along the East Atlantic Flyway. That is all the countries along the coast on the eastern part of the Atlantic Ocean monitor birds as they fly from their wintering ground to their breeding ground every year.
A 2015 study on migratory birds called for a greater international collaborative effort to save the world's migratory birds, many of which are at risk of extinction due to loss of habitat along their flight paths. More than 90% of the world's migratory birds are inadequately protected due to poorly coordinated conservation around the world. The research, which included using BirdLife International's data on migratory bird distributions and important bird and biodiversity areas, found huge gaps in the conservation of migratory birds, particularly across China, India, and parts of Africa and South America. This results in the majority of migratory birds having ranges that are well covered by protected areas in one country, but poorly protected in another. More than half of migratory bird species traveling the world's main flyways have suffered serious population declines in the past 30 years. This is due mainly to unequal and ineffective protection across their migratory range and the places they stop to refuel along the routes. A typical migratory bird relies on many different geographic locations throughout its annual cycle for food, rest, and breeding. So even if we protect most of their breeding grounds, it is still not enough. Threats somewhere else can affect the entire population.
Migratory birds they need fuel for this journey. So they store up fat, which is basically gotten from eating a lot. So by eating a lot, they store up excess fat, and that fat is converted into mechanical energy as they fly. So it's a case of getting fuel ready, available, and then flying across. Now, the journey itself is quite tasking because you have two major barriers. For birds that come all the way from Europe into Africa, you have two major barriers to cross. You have to cross first the Mediterranean Sea, and then when you get into Africa, you have to also cross the Sahara. So that's for the land birds. Some other birds will fly along the coast. So they take along the coast like most water birds will do. They fly along the coast of Africa down all the way to South Africa. So it's a case of different strategies for different species, but the underlying mechanism is quite the same, that you have a migratory program that controls migration, and also you have adaptation to store fat, which is required for the journey.
Of 1,451 migratory bird species, 1,324 had inadequate protection for at least one part of their migration pathway. 18 species had no protection in their breeding areas, and 2 species had no protection at all along their whole route. For migratory bird species listed as threatened, less than 3% have sufficient protected areas. Many populations of migratory land bird species that migrate over land distances between and within Africa and Eurasia are particularly vulnerable because they cross the territory of different countries and make these annual and cyclical movements on a broad front. Having a widely dispersed distribution across habitats, there is increasing concern regarding a considerable number of African Eurasian migratory land bird species, especially those that spend the non-breeding season south of the Sahara, that have declining population trends at a national, regional, and/or global level. There is also concern over the lack of knowledge of the status and trends of many migratory land bird species in Africa and Asia. Urgent action is needed to reverse significant population declines.
We have the least concern, we have the vulnerable, we have the near threatened, we have the vulnerable, we have the critically endangered. We have the endangered and the critically endangered. So all those status are put based on the population estimate. And usually these monitoring that we do across these regions is geared towards monitoring their population so that then they will come up with their population status, which will be able to now tell, okay, this population actually needs, this species need more conservation effort to be put towards it so that they don't go into extinction. We've seen situations whereby their status have been reversed, probably from near threatened to this concern, or from vulnerable to near threatened, or from critically endangered to vulnerable. So there are situations that has happened. So that's why you need to monitor them. So as you monitor them, you'll be able to tell you what stage they are and then what conservation effort needs to be put, because resources are limited.
The annual departure and arrival of migratory birds is a spectacle which arouses emotions in many people and has symbolic meaning in numerous cultures around the world. Many of these birds travel vast distances, crossing several countries and entire continents during their annual migration cycle. Their journeys take them along invisible highways, often stopping at suitable sites along the way to feed, breed, and rest. These international corridors of bird migration, which stretch from the breeding to the non-breeding areas of groups of birds, are referred to as flyways. Changes at one site may have a detrimental effect on the success of the bird's completion of their migration cycle and an effect on their survival. Conservation of migratory bird species must therefore aim at conserving all important sites found on the flyways. In addition, conservation efforts made by states and other actors are more effective if they are coordinated at the flyway scale. The need to conserve and manage all critical sites on a given flyway across borders is now recognized and called the flyway approach to conservation. Flyway conservation aims at conserving the important sites migratory bird species require along the entire migratory range. It recognizes that international cooperation is essential to ensure that migratory birds find the necessary resources and sites they need along their entire flyway to complete their annual journeys. It calls upon states and the international conservation community to work together to understand the problems migratory birds encounter throughout their life cycle and encourages countries to cooperate to sustainably protect and manage populations of these species. The concept provides the overall framework for this international cooperation and has evolved into a broad policy framework encouraging international cooperation between governments and non-governmental organizations towards the transboundary international flyway scale conservation of migratory birds. The flyway concept has been applied in various parts of the world for different groups of migratory bird species and geographical regions. It continues to be a valuable concept in formulating international conservation policy for the protection of migratory birds and the networks of critical sites upon which they depend. With the advent of legally binding multilateral treaties such as the Convention on Migratory Species and the African-Eurasia Migratory Waterbird Agreement, as well as several other formal and informal international agreements and memoranda of understanding, the concept has proved valuable in focusing attention on strategic needs for migrating birds within defined geographical regions. In addition, several other international organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, are directly or indirectly applying the concept and are working to improve the flyway level conservation of migratory birds and the critical for water birds, mostly wetland sites they depend on. For example, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. The Convention on Wetlands, called the Ramsar Convention, is an international treaty that provides the framework for national action and international cooperation for the conservation and wise use of wetlands and their resources. The convention entered into force in Nigeria on the 2nd of February 2001. Nigeria currently has 11 sites designated as wetlands of international importance, with a surface area of over 1 million hectares.
Hadejanguru wetlands, which is a very important stopover for birds migrating through over the Sahara Desert. Then you have the East Atlantic Flyway, where you have birds migrating along the coasts, along the coastline of Africa, right from Europe, as I mentioned. So the wetlands, at least in Nigeria, that we've done so far, there are some threats that are going on quite all right on the wetlands. We have sand dredging, sand mining. Dredging is going on. We have the destruction of the mangrove ecosystem, which is not very good. And we have sometimes agricultural activities as well that are happening, which are destroying our mangrove. But so far, what we have is something that we can say our wetlands are still good for the birds.
Naturally, functioning wetlands provide a range of benefits and services for people's livelihoods and well-being, including food, fiber, flood protection, water purification, and support for cultural values, as well as water supply. Wetlands are extremely rich in biodiversity. Water birds such as herons, egrets, swans, ducks and geese, and waders use wetlands during the majority of their lifetime. At least 12% of all globally threatened birds, 146 species of them, depend on wetlands. The most important types of wetlands for these birds are lakes and pools, rivers and streams, bogs, marshes, and swamps, as well as coastal lagoons.